Predator, the often imitated, never bettered pinnacle of the monster movie sci-fi horror action hybrid. Die Hard, hailed by many as one of, if not the single greatest action film ever made. One might think the man who made these two stone-cold classics back-to-back near the start of his career, no less, should have led a long and illustrious career into old age. But director John McTiernan's filmography is far smaller than a genre-defining filmmaker of his pedigree should be expected to put out in the 36 years since his career began. McTiernan is not an instance of a meticulous filmmaker taking his time to finely craft each of his films over the course of several years. Instead, he was rather on the opposite end of the spectrum, working fast and usually putting out a new movie every year or two, with films like The Hunt for Red October, Last Action Hero, the Thomas Crown Affair remake, and a return to the Die Hard series in Die Hard with a Vengeance, all to his name. But after 2003's Basic, McTiernan dropped off the map. For the past 20 years, he has largely been missing in action, so let's talk about why. Sometimes a successful filmmaking career can be devastated by one bad movie. Though Basic was something of a box office failure, it played basically no role in his disappearance. What was actually behind McTiernan's disappearance didn't have all that much to do with his filmmaking career whatsoever. So where was McTiernan for all those years? Well, he spent some of that time in prison. To fully unravel this tangled legal scandal, you need to first understand who Anthony Pellicano is. Pellicano was a private investigator who was well known in Hollywood circles, a sort of PI to the stars, and even embraced the nickname the celebrity's thug. That on its own could all be above board. The trouble comes with Pellicano's methods, namely his penchant for wiretapping. Wiretapping is illegal, if you didn't know, with the only exception being with a warrant issued by a judge. Needless to say, Pellicano was doing this under the table. Wiretapping can be tried as either a misdemeanor or a felony, and in Pellicano's case, they gave him the full-bore felony charges and convicted him on multiple counts of wiretapping, conspiracy to commit wiretapping, and also racketeering, though the racketeering was only tangentially related.
I'm considered to be the highest priced and the best.
Magnum himself, as far as what he does, is a joke.
Yeah, in what way?
Well, you'd be in jail with some of the stuff he does.
Do you watch those TV shows about private eyes and so forth?
I've written some episodes for some of them.
Really? What did you write for?
Magnum.
After trial, he was sentenced to 15 years in prison. He ended up serving 11 years of that term and was released in 2019. Pellicano wasn't some kind of underground operator. He was schmoozing with some of the biggest names in Hollywood, including the likes of Chris Rock, Sylvester Stallone, and Tom Cruise, amongst plenty of others. At the time, many considered this to be the biggest scandal Hollywood had ever faced. Also on that list of Hollywood figures associated with Pellicano was, you guessed it, John McTiernan. But why was it that this scandal hit him harder than the numerous other celebrities tied to it? Well, it mostly comes down to plausible deniability and a little thing called perjury. You see, most of the Hollywood figures who hired Pellicano had no idea he was going to break the law to carry out whatever investigation they hired him for. Or at least, they were able to claim that. They had enough plausible deniability to wriggle out of responsibility. John McTiernan didn't, but he did try to deny it anyway. McTiernan hired Pellicano to, let's say, look into Chuck Roven, who is another Hollywood figure. He's one of the top dog producers at Warner Brothers. Roven and McTiernan worked together on Rollerball, which was McTiernan's penultimate film before dropping off the map. The film was released in 2002, but McTiernan hired Pellicano in 2000, around the time that the film was shot. His reason for spying on him was directly related to that film, with McTiernan and Roven clashing behind the scenes, and McTiernan wanting to know what Roven was saying behind his back to the studio executives. Unlike most of the Hollywood figures who hired Pellicano, McTiernan had no plausible deniability whatsoever, because, somewhat ironically considering the circumstances, he was recorded discussing the wiretapping with Pellicano. He couldn't pretend he didn't know about Pellicano's illegal methods because he explicitly requested the wiretap on recording. It was never proven whether or not Pellicano carried through with wiretapping Roven. McTiernan has said that after hiring him, he got radio silence from Pellicano for a couple of weeks, then decided to just pay him off and fire him. Reports conflict on this next point, but McTiernan's ex-wife later accused him of hiring Pellicano to wiretap her as well while they were in the midst of their divorce. To be clear, the recording of McTiernan and Pellicano only incriminates him in the Chuck Roven wiretap case. There's no proof that he had anything to do with wiretapping his ex-wife, or if that even happened. And that case was never ruled on. It took the form of a civil lawsuit, not a criminal charge. The thing that actually landed McTiernan in the most hot water was the perjury. While the FBI was investigating all of Pellicano's crimes, they questioned McTiernan under oath. He lied and then later tried to suppress that recording of him and Pellicano discussing the wiretap, but he was unsuccessful. When it came to the actual trial and sentencing, McTiernan faced a lot of back and forth difficulties. He initially pled guilty as part of a plea deal, but there were two issues with this. The first is that the prosecutors didn't hold up their end of the deal because they thought that he was still being dishonest and had no remorse for his actions. The second was that McTiernan may have gotten bad legal counsel. He later fired the counsel who told him to take this plea deal, and his new lawyers told him that he actually had a much better shot at successfully pleading not guilty than he had previously been led to believe. But by then, the damage was already done. He tried to reverse his guilty plea, and his request for that went all the way to the Supreme Court, but they shot it down. He appealed the ruling multiple times, but was ultimately unsuccessful. In early interviews, McTiernan seemed to be under the impression that he was headed for 4 months in a minimum security prison camp. He said his appeals were more about the principle of the matter, and that he wasn't afraid of serving his time. The reality was more severe than he was expecting. In fact, it was triple the length. He wound up being sentenced to a full 12 months in a federal penitentiary in South Dakota. It was a minimum security institution, but it was significantly worse than McTiernan anticipated. When The Guardian spoke to his wife while he was serving his sentence, she described him as disintegrating in front of her eyes. He ended up serving from April 3rd, 2013 to February 25th, 2014, with the last 2-ish months of his sentence being served under house arrest. This is the reason behind John McTiernan's filmography ending abruptly in 2003. He might have only been physically behind bars for 1 year, but the entire legal case took up years of his life, and the ramifications of it have rippled in every direction. For one thing, this whole ordeal left his financials in a state of disarray. He filed for bankruptcy while in prison, and his home was foreclosed on. McTiernan's radio silence in the film community is not for lack of trying, not even close. He hasn't picked up a new credit since 2003, but if you look into his activities, you will find numerous projects that failed to get off the ground or fell apart at some point along the way. He has tried to get many films made both before and after his sentence, but nothing has stuck. When speaking to The Hollywood Reporter directly after his sentencing, McTiernan mentioned that he had been working on a movie about an airplane pilot for a full 2 years, which was then canned when his legal troubles started. He doesn't name the film, so either the project was permanently shelved or a new director was brought in by whatever studio was in charge to finish it. Look at any movie about an airplane pilot released in the last 12 or so years, and that could be it. Was it Flight? Could have been. The world may never know. He also had an action movie in the works called Shrapnel. The Hollywood Reporter asked him about this one while he was appealing his sentencing, and he said the project was still planned to start production in the spring. Of course, when he lost his appeals, that didn't end up working out. By the way, it isn't immediately apparent since the film came out a couple of years later and the title was changed, but Shrapnel did eventually come out. Mark Steven Johnson took over, the director behind the Ben Affleck Daredevil and Nick Cage Ghost Rider, and the film was released under the title Killing Season, which you might be familiar with. It's a pretty mediocre and generic action B-movie, with the most notable thing about it being John Travolta sporting maybe the strangest facial hair look I've ever seen on a big Hollywood actor. One has to imagine if McTiernan had been able to stay in the director's chair, if that movie would have turned out considerably better. He was also slated to direct a $30 million action thriller called Run. Now, there have been a few projects titled Run that have come out in the years since, but as far as I can tell, it isn't any of them. McTiernan was supposed to be making the film for Pierce Williams Production Company, and none of their films are it. So I think this project was scrapped entirely, or it completely changed hands. And McTiernan has had even more canceled projects. Without going into details on any of them, he told The Hollywood Reporter that he had 3 other films all in the works that then all got scrapped over these legal troubles. He said that it largely came down to insurance. You can't make a movie at that massive scale without production insurance, and you can't get production insurance without being able to guarantee 18 months, which with a prison sentence looming over your head isn't possible. The constant appeals and attempted reversal and hearings and everything kept prolonging the case in the courts over the course of a few years, but only in little increments at a time, making it totally impossible for him to get proper production insurance throughout that entire period of time. One of the most interesting films he worked on throughout this tumultuous period also came completely out of left field. It was a documentary called The Political Prosecutions of Karl Rove. If you don't know who Karl Rove is, that's a whole different tangled mess that I'm not going to get too deep into in this video. The basics are that he was George W. Bush's senior advisor and deputy chief of staff during his presidency, and that he was a controversial figure under investigation for numerous matters. McTiernan's documentary attempted to dig into those controversies, but it also had a decidedly personal motive, because in what either sounds like hardcore investigative journalism or a conspiracy theory, McTiernan claims that Rove was responsible for the investigation into Pellicano that landed him in hot water. He claims it was politically motivated and purposefully engineered as a way to take down Democrats, and that the entire investigation was unjust as a result. And there might be some truth to that, who knows. The weird thing about this documentary is that it did actually come out. It wasn't scrapped entirely, but it is nearly impossible to find that documentary today. It was completed in 2009, before his stint in prison, and McTiernan even went around doing press for it. I'll include a clip of him promoting it on the Young Turks, but be warned that the video quality is terrible. This is the only copy of the recording that I could find, and the original video is no longer up on the Young Turks YouTube channel. This is some re-upload.
It was all made up. It was all completely made up.
So who do you think did that, and how did they get a $3.5 million signing bonus?
No, what's the name?
No,
Name
you
is
don't have to give me
Michael
the-
Garcia.
Uh-huh.
Was the he's been a Republican activist and Federalist Society member since he was in high school. He was a jack of all trades for the first 3 or 4 years in the Bush administration. They made him U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York. One of the first things he did is he used the Patriot Act to send FBI squads through the personal finances of most of the major Democrats in New York. That's how he got on the fact that Spitzer had hired a prostitute.
So if this documentary was finished and was purportedly released, then why isn't it listed on IMDb, Rotten Tomatoes, or Letterboxd? The documentary definitely exists. People have seen it. It was shown to the Young Turks, to the Hollywood Reporter, and even this guy, David Swanson, who wrote a blog post about it, which says that the documentary is embedded below, but it isn't. I think it probably was at one point, but the video was taken down. The same thing happened with the Hollywood Reporter post. You can even see the negative space where it was previously embedded, but it is now gone. This article confirms that McTiernan released the documentary in full and for free online. So the documentary exists, but actually watching this documentary today is another story. It seems possible that McTiernan may have been forced or just pressured to take it offline, either as part of the court case, since it was directly related to it, or due to external political pressure. He was, after all, going after a very powerful political figure and making claims that weren't really being made anywhere else. He might have been threatened with legal action on those grounds. Whatever the reason was, it seems to have been scrubbed from the internet. I even tried running the pages that used to have it embedded through the Wayback Machine, and I searched the Internet Archive for traces of it, and I found nothing. At least that was the case, until I kept digging a little bit more, and I did eventually find it. I found it buried deep in the media files of DonSiegelman.org. The reason why this embedded video is still up while the others were taken down is because this is not the official copy of the movie, but rather some unauthorized re-upload to Vimeo from 9 years ago under the innocuous title of Project Justice Small. There's no description and no mention on the page of this being John McTiernan's documentary, The Political Prosecutions of Karl Rove, but it is. After finally watching it, I can personally confirm that the overarching point is about the targeting of Democrats and the selective enforcement of the law with the powers of the state. He includes himself in the leagues of the numerous Democratic politicians who were targeted by Rove, though McTiernan, of course, isn't the politician himself. He even appears on camera, directly addresses the audience, and talks about the situation a little bit. So, there we go. This is technically another directorial effort from John McTiernan that exists post-2003's Basic. It's not at all what any fans of the director would be hoping for, and honestly, it's kind of a stretch to even call this a documentary, since it's only about 52 minutes and a huge chunk of that runtime is just text over black. It's not much of a documentary, honestly. It's more just a collection of interviews, but hey, it is something. And it's actually not the only thing McTiernan has managed to direct to completion. As bizarre as it sounds, John McTiernan directed this advertisement for the video game Ghost Recon Wildlands. And also, it wasn't the only one he made for the game either. Now, they don't really escape their status as being commercials, but they do have McTiernan finally directing some action again. Other projects that he tried to make since leaving prison that failed to find traction include an action thriller called Red Squad and a sequel to his remake of the Thomas Crown Affair titled Thomas Crown and the Missing Lioness, the latter of which he wrote while in prison. He even gave some interviews about making these movies, but it has now been almost an entire decade without any update, so it looks like those aren't happening. Though his attempts to get feature films off the ground over the past 20 years have all resulted in failure, there is still hope that he may yet return with another movie. His only project that might still have a little life left in it is called Tau Ceti 4. It's an action sci-fi movie set on an alien planet. Travis Fimmel and Uma Thurman are the only two confirmed cast members for it at the moment, according to IMDb and a bunch of other places. But it should be noted that they were announced a long, long time ago, and who knows if they're even still involved in the project at this point. I unfortunately have to say that this project, even existing, should be taken with a grain of salt here. The film was announced back in 2019, and we're now 4 years later, without much, if any, progress being made on it since. It's important to note that the film was announced before the start of the COVID-19 pandemic. When speaking to Empire, McTiernan said that they were about to start shooting in Serbia when the pandemic put a halt on all production. He said he wasn't sure how to proceed, but considered either setting up a bubble set or postponing the shoot. I think he ended up postponing it. He also told them that the title is no longer Tau Ceti 4, like what's on IMDb, that it's actually now called Tau Ceti Foxtrot, for whatever that's worth. This is supposedly a leaked storyboard image from the film, but to be honest, I'm not really convinced that it's genuine, despite a bunch of outlets running with it. I mean, it might be, but the source is just this tweet, and I don't really see any reason why so many outlets are taking this tweet as legitimate. I see no reason to believe it personally. There are also some outlets saying that the film started shooting in the fall of 2022, but again, the sources on this are questionable, so I would not take it as fact. And I also wouldn't start counting the chickens on this Tau Ceti Foxtrot movie before they hatch in general. This might just be the latest in a long line of abandoned projects. But all in all, let's hope for the best. Let's hope that John McTiernan does eventually make the triumphant return that he's been attempting to mount for years. He's in his 70s now, having lost a lot of years to this ordeal. But let's hope he has enough time to come back in style and end his career on a high note. Thanks for watching this video essay. You can subscribe if you enjoyed it and you want to see more stuff like it. Check out my other video essays. There will be a playlist on screen. I'll see you next time. So long.